After a super wild card weekend, we are now ready for episode 21 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager, joined by Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, I know we're going to talk about tackles today, and that it has me fired up, right? Because, it's just a cool position to evaluate. But I do want to ask your takeaways from the super wild card weekend that was so far, because we still have a game tonight.
Well, look, I mean, I was amazed at so many levels. I was amazed at some of the losses. I was amazed at some of the wins, opposite side. I'm sitting here talking to Dan Quinn about 3 days ago about a really, really important game for the Cowboys. And then on the other end, talking to my wife, Mimi, who thinks that Tom Brady's going to take it the entire way home once again. So I have all these things floating around in my head. And you know what happened today? I decided to take the holiday with my son, Mason, who again is 15. We went out dirt bike riding, moto riding, and out of the blue, massive mechanical. So we're a little bit late. I just sat down here ready to go. I have thoughts at so many levels, so I look forward to diving in.
By the way, Mason, a listener to the Sumer Sports Show. We really appreciate that. One of the first commenters on our live show. And by the way, we appreciate all of you for listening in when you do. You can obviously, if you're hearing us on the stream live, you can download this, in podcast form. We will also splice this up and give folks little nuggets. Actually, I just got finished, Thomas, with our content strategy this past hour. We have a ton of really cool things planned for you as the listener and the consumer of Sumer Sports. We are really excited for that. And we are going to we have somebody coming on into our company tomorrow, Tej Seth, who was one of my interns at PFF, and he is, brilliant young analyst who will also come and help us on the consumer side, and we are excited for that. We are also excited to have Doug Analytics here, who is happy to be here. If you want to comment on the YouTube, please go ahead and do so. And I also want to on this day, congratulate our own Parker Fleming, one of our data scientists. He and his wife had a baby last week named Clark, healthy. I actually saw a picture full, look, as I get older, my hair starts falling out. I start to see these things, but a full head of hair on that kid. And we were really happy for Parker and his wife. Everything is going swimmingly, and we couldn't be happier for him. So just a really fun week and weekend for Sumer Sports. I do want to take us, Thomas, to something we've been putting up on our Twitter profile at Sumer Sports. This is the road to the playoffs. We are using betting market data here, although we do have some internal simulations. This is where it stands now. Obviously, we have tonight's game between Tampa Bay and Dallas, which you alluded to, which is mucking up the NFC a little bit because you have to distribute those percentages out a little bit. In the AFC, you have Kansas City leading with 22% chance to win the Super Bowl. The Bills at 20%, Bengals at 11%. The Jaguars, the upstart Doug Peterson Jaguars, after a huge comeback last week, are at 3%. And we have the Eagles and 49ers in the NFC. Eagles at 14% to win it. Niners at 16.5%. Now, somebody actually asked us on Twitter. The betting markets actually make the Eagles a higher chance to make the Super Bowl than the Niners, but the Niners have a higher chance to win it. Thomas, I think that's just because of opponents, right? I think the Niners having to face the winner of tonight's game. The winner of tonight's game is a better team than the Giants, I think, even though the Giants were quite good yesterday against Minnesota. And so the Eagles have an easier path to the Super Bowl, but I think once they get there, a 49ers team will probably have a better chance of winning a game against the Chiefs, Bills, or Bengals than the Eagles do.
I like your assessment on it. And again, I continue to be impressed by what the 49ers are doing. And let's make no mistake about it. A quarterback in that situation doing what he's doing, to me, this comes back to their head coach. He has such a good grasp of utilizing the talent, especially at that position. And, I consider, considering where he is, I just think where Kyle Shanahan is, being able to do what he's doing with this team through all the injuries, staying intact and winning and having such confidence. I mean, it's a major kudos to all of them, as well as, we sit there and we talk about, GMs, we talk about John Lynch, but, the fact that you have Adam Peters there, who decided to take his name out of the running for the Tennessee Titans, GM role because he wanted to stay there. I think they have big plans for him, and they rely on him a great deal in 49ers town to make sure that he's putting that team together well for John.
Absolutely. So, and we do have some news in the NFL. We have that the Arizona Cardinals have hired Monty Ossenforth to be their general manager. They were one of only 2 openings so far. It's interesting because Monty went from Tennessee, which is also an open position, to Arizona to take the spot that was Steve Keim until Steve left for health issues. Thomas, do you have any sort of opinion on that before we move on to tackle here?
Look, I do. I mean, Monty and I worked together. He was on our staff there in New England when we were rolling through some of these younger guys, and they're all stepping up, right? You talk about Rand Carthon, you're talking about Monty Ossenforth. You're talking about that whole group that ran through there. I mean, they were produced in a situation there with Bill Belichick and Scott Pioli and a number of us, John Robinson, Jason Light, and they all learned. And I can't believe here we are. These guys are all stepping up to get their opportunity. Monty is a very astute guy. He's very well studied. He's very thought out in his approach. He has a really good understanding, honestly, everyone, whoever's in that situation there, on how to function well with the head coach. Anyone who's come through New England understands how things are there, right? They understand what's going on there. And I think it's a big deal for him to get an opportunity. And I think he's gonna have a really good understanding of how he wants to put it together and how he wants to be side by side with the head coach. This is going to be interesting, though. Who is that head coach going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Tennessee, there's not really necessarily a rising star there, right? So it's probably not going to be an immediate. Now, Monty's been around the league a little bit, but like there's not necessarily an immediate direct connection with the Titans that he can go with in Arizona. So it's going to be much like when you were hired in 2008. I mean, you got Mike Smith was with the Ravens Jacksonville, right? As the DC before then. So you weren't even connected necessarily there. It might be more like that situation in Arizona, this month. Now, here's a question I have for you, because you've had this situation happen to you directly, right? Where you're hired and then immediately you're tasked with hiring a head coach. How different is that from when you hired Dan Quinn, when you were an established general manager, multiple time executive of the year? That's different, right, than what he's going through. What is going through? I mean, he's got to almost immediately have a plan moving forward to hire this coach, and it's a high stakes situation for them.
He has to be ready 100%. It's unbelievably exciting, right? You go home at night every night up to that point while you're still looking for the new head coach, and you can't believe you have a job finally. B, your family can't believe it, your friends can't believe it, all the people you've worked with over the years can't believe it, but are so excited. And then you bring yourself back saying, I don't need to look at that. I need to focus on helping this organization be the best. And you honestly cross a line from sort of marvel into standing up straight saying, okay, they hired me for a reason. And that's because I have a really sound understanding of this game and what I'm going to do going forward. I need to put my best foot forward. I need to be very, very mindful of the type of person we're bringing in as a head coach. I'm speaking from Monty's standpoint. I have to understand that it's also incredibly important to make sure that the assistant groups, the coordinators and the assistants that this head coach potentially brings to the table are really, really sound and are going to work with ownership, Michael Bidwell and the rest of the group. There is a lot on your plate. Believe me, you go to bed at night, usually 1, 2 in the morning, you're up at 6 in the morning and you are rolling. It is not easy. Before you know it, you're at the Senior Bowl. Before you know it, you're at the Combine, and it's just nonstop.
Yeah. By the way, we have a TJ Gonser here repping UWL, Wisconsin lacrosse. My former, when I was a professor, my former employer. We love having old Eagles in the chat. No, I like that, and obviously with Arizona, what's nice for Monty is obviously I think expectations will be a little bit lower because of what they're coming off of and what they're dealing with the injury to the quarterback position. But as you said, it's going to be essential to bring in players and because they don't have a ton in the way of resources. They don't have a ton in the way of great football players. It sounds like, DeAndre Hopkins wants a trade, which is going to seem, I think, he's going to have a market, so that's going to bring you back some players. But obviously, it takes away one of the really core players on your football team, and so there's just a lot to do there. And in a division that, as you said, has the San Francisco 49ers, who are the cusp of that division. You have the Rams, who aren't going to go anywhere now that McVay is returning, and Seattle, who just played in a playoff game. So it's not going to necessarily be trivial for him. Can I
compliment you in bringing this up, and we'll get to it in a minute, but really trying to paint the picture here, because it has a lot of elements to it. Of course, one of the things that we probably should talk about, as I'm jumping around a little bit, is what about those guys that were positioned in the building, who were so-called the favorites to get that GM job in Arizona. That is a big, big deal, man. I'm talking about those guys are really good at what they do. Of course, there had to be a reason. Who knows? Maybe Michael Bidwell's idea was, look, I just want to start anew. I want someone in outside of this group. Think about that. That is not only that, but it also has ramifications of, what's going to be talked about. There's an underrepresented side of that is not coming to fruition. And it's going to be really interesting to see how, the Cardinals handle that. And how those two gentlemen, again, really good football people, what they do. Do they stay there? Do they move on? Does the rest of the staff there, are they miffed because Monty possibly came in, and what do they do? Let's chat quickly about that. That becomes a whole different swirl of information.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, that's a really tough, that's really tough, right? When you bring in, and we're fortunate at Sumer right now that we're building from the ground up. And a lot of us have come in at the same time, but you are going to bring in people at times who are there, who come from the outside. And this is a league, right? We saw with Jeff Saturday, when Jeff Saturday got hired to be the interim coach with the Colts, that was not something that was well received by the people that we talked to. And not to get specific, but it's like, there are people who put in their time. They pay their dues, and again, Monty's not necessarily somebody who hasn't paid his dues, but he hasn't for the Cardinals, right? So, somebody who's, dealt with the intricacies and the idiosyncrasies of the owner, right? Even different teams have different cultures, and you spend a lot of your career, molding yourself to that culture, and then somebody comes and leapfrogs you from the outside. That can lead, I think, to a little bit of consternation and angst. And I, you hope that there are some people that stay there with the players, because that team hasn't been bad. Like Vance Joseph, for example, I'm talking coaches now, not front office. But Vance Joseph at times has done a really good job at that defense. Does he stay? Is he allowed to build on those relationships he's made? Et cetera, et cetera. It's just really hard. I actually like this question from Jim I posted there when you were talking. How much freedom does a new GM have in establishing a new focus areas, like more analytical approach or department, like possibly Arizona or Tennessee? I'm not, we like a lot of people in both buildings. I'm not breaking any ground here when I say that Tennessee is one of those teams that was not adopting analytics nearly as much as some other teams. And I think I'm going to plug our company here. This is where Sumer Sports can come in. I've always said that the difference between football and baseball is, if you are 30th in baseball in analytics, you are probably a decade from becoming 5th. In football, you are not a decade away from being 5th. You are some very strategic hires, and as well as strategic vendor team relationships, a la with us, away from being a top 5 adopter. So I think that is obviously providing a lot of opportunity. And we obviously hope Arizona will take us up on it, because, and teams like that, because there is just such opportunity in the NFL. You can create an edge relatively quickly.
Well, both organizations, and I've told you before, John Robinson is a very good friend of mine, and I think he's really good at what he does. Of course, they made the move, unbeknownst to many of us in the league, but their approach was not cutting edge as far as, maybe what Eric DeCosta is doing, or Howie Roseman, or Andrew Berry. There was an element of old school there. I guarantee you, I'm who am I to say this, of course, but I can almost guarantee you that if Ryan Cowden stays with Mike Vrabel, who's a very smart guy, they're going to take a deep breath and start thinking about what is around the corner, what's on the front end of the curve that they need to tap into to see what can help them be better. A la, you're talking about Sumer Sports, anything analytic wise to make more exactness to the team building is very important. I would say the same thing on the Cardinals side. I mean, Steve Keim is, I've said this time and again, and people can have whatever they want to say. This, the health reasons are unfortunate, but a really, really good football evaluator and understander of that. But again, an organization that wasn't on the front end of the curve as far as that was their desire, right? Now Monty comes in. Monty's a bright guy. Monty's going to have to take that element, I'm sure, sit down with Mr. Bidwell, talk about what's next, think about who they're bringing in. Who knows? We don't know this right now. There could be someone waiting in the wings, maybe used to coach for the Saints. You never know, and they're going to be relying on Monty to carry the torch, so to speak, on a lot of different areas that maybe Sean Payton, if that were to be the case, hypothetically, is not. That's not his world at this point. Even though Sean's a very front thought thinking guy, but this is a big thing. How does this play out for Monty? And what is Monty going to be in that organization? Is he going to be GM with the power and the strength? We call it respectfully. Or is he going to be a GM light for the first 2, 3, or 4 years? You never know that. GM light doesn't necessarily mean the GM doesn't have final football say. You could not have final football say and still not be considered a GM light. We could go on and on talking about that another time, another place. But this whole thing fascinates me, how this is going to play out and who is going to be at the helm at both of those.
I mean, this is team building in every sense of the word, right? And obviously we think of football teams as the players on the field, and we're going to talk about that in a minute or two here. But it's also about team building within the organization. And I also think, much like if you're drafted to be a backup quarterback, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be one your entire career. Look at Russell Wilson, look at Kirk Cousins, look at guys like that. Just because you may have to assume a GM light role early doesn't necessarily mean you won't be able to assert, your stamp on the team as much as other guys. I think of Brett Veach, who was very much put in place in Kansas City because Andy Reid won the power struggle, and power struggle is too heavy of a word, but one, Andy Reid stayed, John Dorsey went, Brett Veach assumed that role, and because of his, frankly, his competence and how well he's done in many ways, has earned what I would consider to be a powerful role in Kansas City, and that can happen for anybody in that role. And so it doesn't mean don't take that position. It just means have expectations that are reasonable there. So it's so fascinating. I can't wait to see what Tennessee does with their job, and I can't wait for this offseason to talk about teams, maybe on their second year of a GM. I feel like we can fill up an entire podcast with the difference between what Kwesi has to deal with in Minnesota and Ryan Poles has to deal with in the division rival Chicago Bears, given their different initial conditions and what has happened this year with the Vikings winning 13 games and the Bears winning 3 games. So very, very good stuff. Thomas, people are excited about this tackle evaluation, and so am I, because I think it's really interesting when you look at analytics and where it's come, because the offensive line, there's no more. It's funny because the offensive line is no more. There's no more grueling thing in football, right? It's you have to be tough. You have to use your phrase, nut up and block the guy in front of you. And yet I found offensive line play when I played, tight end, but I was in the room. I found offensive line play to be one of the coolest, most intricate parts of the game of football as well. And so when you're looking to draft and evaluate and to develop tackles, to me, obviously the physical stuff matters so much. But can you give me the whole picture on what you're looking for in a tackle?
So first of all, it's very important to know your head coach, your offensive coordinator, and of course the style of offense you're going to play. That's really, really important. Number one. Number two is understanding, are you coming in to your acquisition of O-linemen and tackle specifically in a zone scheme, outside scheme, inside? just a full-on banger type. Like, look, we went through so many different approaches when I was with Mike Smith, and then later on after we moved on from some of our O-line coaches, and they do dictate what you're doing. The O-line coach is vital, and I want to talk about that in a couple minutes. But where we were when we had Mike Tice, and I love Mike Tice. I told you the other day, love him. In the end, however, before Smitty got fired, Mike Tice, we were about big, just knocking people. We were wanting 350-pound tackles. We weren't about the athletic guy. That was what Mike wanted. As you know, that was Mike's approach. Interestingly enough, Mike Smith gets fired after that, and we had just invested in some big boys on both sides of the O and D line, interestingly enough. And then all of a sudden, you come in with Dan Quinn, and Dan's all about athleticism, quick twitch, explosiveness. That's a whole other thing that I would warn any uprising executive, up-and-comers. It's tough, and I would say to any owner, on that last year, when you're wondering whether you're going to stay with a coach and you're going to switch around and invest, that's a tough investment. There's a lot of money out. So anyway, I want to come back to tackle. I'm sorry I went off on a tangent a little bit there. Really, really important. O-line coach, really important. It starts with deciding on the tackle side, is this person a left tackle, and is he a right tackle? And that's where we can start. And go back to you, and I'll come back and we can start the process.
Well, I do want to I want to add a little evidence to what you're saying, because I think rebuilding an offensive line is incredibly hard. And it's incredibly hard because you cannot just shore up. Like, you need probably 6 to 8 guys who are really good. Here's an example. This is from a Pro Football Focus article that I wrote last year about what I call perfectly blocked run plays. And pass plays are about the same. The magnitude is not as big. But here's a graph, and for those who are listening on the show, listening on the podcast, I apologize a little bit, but this is more for the stream. Expected points added. If you look at this, basically, if you have no one that messes up on the offensive line in a play, it's worth about half a point more, right? And the chances for big plays, which is this fat green part that doesn't intersect with the gray part, is so much more heavy. You cannot generate effective run plays when a guy screws up. Yeah, it's just hard. And so when you look at, like, let's say going from a Mike Tice to the next offensive line coach, and you have to switch 3 or 4 guys because they don't fit, that can screw up your offensive efficiency so much, because it's not about getting, in many ways, it's not necessarily about getting that elite tackle, even though that guy, is great. It's about making sure your other tackle doesn't suck. And I think that is such an important part. And part of, like, your thing about, offensive line coaches, what Mike Tice was so good at in Minnesota was Matt Burke was a 7th round pick. Chris Lewinsky was a 6th round pick, 7th round pick. Corbin Lucina was a nobody. He was able to, develop the lower tiers of the offensive line. And those Vikings offenses, when he was, offensive line coach and then head coach, were so good because there were no weak points on that. The one year he got fired was the year that Burke was injured, and they the one year that Corey Stringer died and stuff, it kind of got, haywire for him. But he kind of understood that. And in transitioning from one coach to another, like, I think that's a misunderstood part of what that transition looks like.
Oh, there's no question. And by the way, remember, and I'm going to drop some little tidbits here. Like, for instance, did you know, and do you know the definition of what a mushroom is in the O-line vernacular? Look it up, everyone out there. It was their own little group. The mushrooms have gone on for decades and decades and decades, and they had their very, very strong group O-line coaches across the country. They talked, they hung out, they partied together, they drank beer together, they ate. They talked O-line scheme all the time. It was a really tight-knit group. And they were a big part of making sure that it was interesting, because a lot of those guys talked, and they would honestly share behind the scenes, much to the chagrin of many GMs and head coaches, but they were really, really close. And there were some great ones out there. One of my favorite O-line coaches, I just want to leave you with this, Dante Scarnecchia, one of the very, very, very best ever to coach in the National Football League out in New England. And what he shared with all of us who worked there, either as personnel men or up and coming executives, was just unbelievable. Let's start with this, if you don't mind, and then we can go back and forth, Eric. So what I'd love to do is say, let's differentiate between left tackle and right tackle. And let's start with the run game first, because you brought the run game up. As an evaluator, and we don't have to stay on this too long, but as an evaluator, back to the same thing I've mentioned before, snap the whistle. It's the initial quickness, right? So let's go run first. Left side. That left side is all about athleticism for the most part. I mean, there are some big guys that play on the left side. It's about quick twitch. It's about explosiveness, fast feet, agile feet, the ability to get your ass around to the hole, we call it. I know that sounds a little odd play on words. Ass to the hole, steer, wall off, has the eyes to see to the next step, to the next stage, right? So can come off the ball fast and move over to the linebacker, can seal, has the ability to run his feet upon contact, has the power to move people away, has the power to wall off, strong hands inside, dominate. These tackles, you want to be able to see them. We call them gore. We want to see them gore at the end of the play. So it's everything, but it all starts with the initial movement, get position, get things going, run, explode, strength, maneuver, and dominate.
Yeah, and I think, it's so interesting, right? Because you talk about, and this, there's a little bit of, the end of, the second half of your Falcons career that where you guys are mostly a zone, or you guys were a zone running team that gets into that, right? Where, a lot of what a tackle is supposed to do is get a gap over, right, on the backside of a run play. And that is so hard to do when you're not athletic, because the big thing that is so tough, is so difficult, and one of the things that I really want to study. The Big Data Bowl came out and was on offensive and defensive line play in the passing game, but I do want to, in the run game, it's important too. There is no bigger athletic mismatch in an NFL game than between tackle and edge. Because there's the defensive ends are like closer to wide receivers athletically than they are tackles. And as a tackle, you have to, and I know Mitchell Schwartz, by the way, I'm going to plug this. Thomas Dimitroff is going to be on the Sloan football analytics panel. Last year, Mitchell Schwartz on that same panel talked about, because Mitchell Schwartz was a -2 standard deviation athlete, but he was an amazing football player. He talked about, how he had to engineer his steps to make sure that he was getting to the right spots. And, I think with tracking data and stuff analytically, we can really measure that. But you're talking about getting a gap over, and that's just so hard if the guy doesn't have athleticism. So he could be a college prospect who wins, right? Wins over and over and over again. And yet at the same time doesn't have that athleticism. He's just going to have a really hard time in the league.
That right. And to that point, and then flipping it over to the right, stand run for a minute. All that I mentioned, of course, you want to see that in your right tackle, but you understand you're going to see it at a lesser degree than your left tackle. But your right tackle is going to have, normally that right tackle, of course, is going to be more powerful. When I talked about steering, when I talk about controlling and walling off, he's going to do that hopefully exponentially better than that left side, even though you still want to see your left tackle do that. You're going to see him drive people off the ball and control. That's a big thing, right? You're going to get people behind him, running behind him to get those tough yards, of course. Both of these guys have to get out a little bit on the edge. You'd expect more on your left side, meaning if he's blocking out on an outside run, both of them need to do it. Look at it this way: any of those who the tackles in the league, and for us, we drafted Jake Matthews. He was a quintessential left tackle. I don't know. PFF probably has him at 15 this year. He's kind of always been in that area. Caleb McGarry, on the other hand, was that prototypical right tackle. A little bit more heavy plodding, not in a bad athlete way. I thought for his size, he was a good athlete, a 6 athlete, where Jake was more of a 7 or an 8 athlete, very good to excellent athlete. Both of these guys have their abilities to run and to move people in the run game and do what they need to do, but they're both very, very different athletes, and they both are really, really important to the building of your football team. I'd like to stop there on the run game, and then when we can come back to the pass, because I think that's vital that we talk about it.
Yeah, for sure. And it just it kind of, it changes if you have differences in athletes there, right? It's sort of, some teams have that. I know Jim just talked about Orlando Brown, who's the Chiefs left tackle. He had a brief stint at left tackle when Ronnie Stanley was hurt for the Ravens, but for the most part, he was a right tackle there. He goes to Kansas City to replace Eric Fisher after Fisher tore his Achilles in the 2021 playoffs. He's been okay. Actually, he's gotten a lot better as the Chiefs' schedule has gotten better, but hasn't been, amazing. I do think it is interesting that you make the distinction between right and left tackle, because I think a lot of people, it's this sort of weird thing, right? Where as somebody, I played tight end, you have to play both sides of the line of scrimmage, but you always have a side where your feet work better, right? You're a right, I like the right side. When it was left, I was always a little awkward having to try to reach a guy on a zone play from the left side. And so what's interesting is what happens when you have, like, I think of Kansas City this way, where your athlete at tackle is actually your right tackle, and Mitchell Schwartz was that way, and your left tackle is more of the not plotter. I didn't think Eric Fisher was a plotter, but he was not as good. And so and we'll talk about the passing game, but like you don't want to insist that your best athlete plays left tackle, because the footwork has to be more natural for that player because of the athleticism difference that is inherent in it. You don't want to make sure that your best athlete is the left tackle, because if his footwork is off, it almost negates almost all of his athleticism. So there is an interesting, confluence there, and that might be where you can find an edge in the NFL, which is, and the Chiefs did it, right? When Mitchell Schwartz signed his initial deal, he was making, I think, $6 million a year. And he was like a third of a win to a half of a win player. They got such a surplus there that any weaknesses that Eric Fisher had were mitigated by the surplus that they were getting in Mitchell Schwartz, which was really a cool example of like the exception proving the rule.
Exception. And there are exceptions. And you're exactly right. I do want to say we for the most part, basically, we think left, best athlete, right, not as good of an athlete normally. But there are so many ways to be creative with that. That over the many, many years, if you watch the NCAA, the really good athletes were flipping, right? Mm-hmm. Depending on where they were. I mean, I used to love watching athletes like that in the NCAA, where I could see them on both sides, because I thought it was really ideal to really determine their versatility. Let's not lose this. Whether it's left tackle, right tackle, most athletic, a little bit less athletic, versatility works in there too. Do not ever lose the allure of versatility for these O linemen, especially on the O tackle side. Really, really important. And what you just said earlier, it's not always the left side. Sometimes you could get creative. And what would happen was what was really interesting. You'd take your right tackle, and even that right tackle, your left tackle is playing well. Your right tackle, a guard gets injured, and all of a sudden, I mean, I've seen things like this. That right tackle is moving over to left tackle, and your left tackle is moving into guard, because you have to get your placement right. So it's imperative that your O-line coach, your coordinator, and your team builders know what you truly have. And if you do need to adjust them a little bit, it's very important. By the way, a little aside, in today's world, very, very tough to develop these O-linemen. Not like 20 and 30 years ago, where they could just bang each other's ass inside practice after practice. They're not doing that anymore. We came up short on so many O-linemen, and many people in the league did. A lot of these GMs are getting people, darts thrown at them. They're just not able to develop the O-linemen as well as we used to, because they're not able to do it the same way. And before you know it, they just kind of just fade away. And it's unfortunate, because you have to develop these cats inside. Really, really important. Do you want to come back and talk about that pass, or do you want to?
Yeah, let's talk about pass game. I do want to, by the way, give you your flowers a little bit, by the way, because you were in some ways a victim of this, where you drafted Lindstrom and McGarry in one draft. Those guys have both earned the top grade by PFF this year at their position. And we do know this, right? Like, Timo Risky, my former colleague at PFF, did show like, this is what people have known forever, but it was good to see it statistically. The closer you are to the ball, the harder it is to develop as an NFL player. And so, people wanted to write those two guys off right away as failures, but of course they grow. Another example is Andrew Thomas, who, I wrote about at PFF. I did send those show notes out on Twitter. Thomas was terrible as a rookie. But he's become one of the league's best players the last 2 years. It just takes time. And you want to be in a situation like the Eagles, where you can draft Andre Dillard and sit him until he's ready. But most teams and your Falcons team, because of the composition of your roster, those guys had to play right away, and that was a great part of their development. But obviously, it oftentimes takes a while for those guys to see, for the teams to see the fruit of their labor. When it comes to the passing game, Thomas, this is one where I think from an analytical standpoint, easier to evaluate. Because you're talking about it, you're more independent. You're not completely independent, but more independent. It's like baseball where you're win and loss, right? You're playing a defensive end over and over and over again. There's some context that has to go into it. But when you're looking at it from a scout, an evaluator standpoint, what are you looking for?
Same thing off the ball, the initial movement, the first step to slide, right? As you're sliding, just so everyone knows, you're sliding with the pass rush, of course. Sliding to the left, the ability to redirect and come back inside, to have the hips to flip. I'm still working off the left side here, right? As your athlete, your ability to get your hands up and you utilize your hands in a fast way. We drafted Sam Baker, who was a good player. We moved up, probably should have drafted him in the second round. He played some good football for us. He had short arms, and you hear it all the time. It is a legit thing if you have short arms and you don't utilize your hands quick, fast, explosively. If you have short arms, man, you bet your hands better be beautifully fast and explosive. Very important to do that. Very important to keep it in front of you. You have to have the eyes. You have to be able to follow your pass rusher. You have to have a nice, strong base. And again, you have to be underneath yourself. You have to sit. You have to be able to sit so that when that pass rusher decides he's going to flip it and speed to power you, your ass isn't getting flown back into the quarterback, which happens many times. And many of us as GMs have had people like that where you're pulling your hair out thinking, just sit your ass down, anchor in, get your hands up, play with this guy. Don't let him push you back 4 and 5 yards. So that left tackle, man, he's got all of that going on, and he has to have the ability to sit down. He is not going to be as big and solid and sound and anchor-like as the right side. Again, prototypically, those guys are going to have the same thing, but that right side is nowhere near going to slide and redirect, slide and mirror as well as the left tackle. He still has to be able to have a nice, strong base, and he still has to have ability to redirect and get his hips back around. He still needs strong-ass hands to prevent the speed to power. That's going to happen on that side, as you know. They're going to try to ramrod that tackle back. Hopefully you have a big enough, strong enough guy on the right side as a pass protector. Again, always needs to have both of those guys. I'll finish with this. They have to have an awareness to pass off and accept the stunts, right? That's a big, big thing. You can't have a numbnut on either side. That's probably the wrong word. You have to have a guy who has a nice, strong brain about him. I'm not talking about a school brain. I'm talking about an understanding of football. Has to be alert, has to be aware.
Thomas, firstly, I want to commend. I'm so excited because I get you in these situations where, because you're very, you're very progressive and you're very you're a CEO of a football analytics company now, but there's a part of me that's like, oh, I can't wait to watch film with you and to be able to codify all the words you just said, because I do think that with tracking data and with all these things we can do, we can quantify all the things, like not getting ramrodded, which is we could actually create a column in our data frame that says ramrodded 0-1, and we could get through that. That was such a good explanation of what you're looking for. And when I'm looking, and I know there's a lot of analytics folks listening to the show, I think that there's very much a way that we can codify those things in our data, because, one of the things when I was looking at the tracking data for the Big Data Bowl, and one of the, a few people had come up to me, by the way, if, I don't have infinite amount of time, but if you ever want to, just throw me a question on Twitter, I can certainly help. But one of the things I wanted to look at was, what kind of depth does a guy get, right? A lot of what you're saying is is he athletic enough to get depth, right? Or, when, how much, when he's engaged. I know StatsBomb does this a little bit. When engagement happens, how far does he move and stuff like that? And what I was running into was the same problem I tried to solve at Pro Football Focus, which was, not all the plays are created equally. And one of the things I did at Pro Football Focus is I built, and it's part of their product right now, I built what was called true pass sets. So I only look at passing plays that lasted, I believe it was more than 2.5 seconds.
Mhm.
I only looked at passing plays that didn't involve screens. I think they actually, in a sense, have taken out plays where there's a chip block or something like that, but literally just looking at the one-on-one plays. And when you do that, you can really look at a lot of the stuff that you're looking at, which is like when he's isolated, does he get moved off his spot? That, what about creating like a passing map for a tackle where you look at like how much depth does he get in the first 2 seconds of the play, and how successfully is he at various depths, and those kind of things. One question I had, because I've done a lot of tackle eval when I was at PFF, and Andrew Thomas, by the way, I feel really good about this. There's still an article on the web that says Andrew Thomas is the best tackle in the 2020 class. It looked horrible at first. It looks okay now. But do you look at competition when you're looking at like, do you throw out plays if a guy's playing a weaker defensive end or something like that? Like, how do you handle the competition aspect of tackle? Because, shrinking down that space, of course, helps you understand when he's going to play an NFL caliber end, but it also lowers the sample space.
Oh, there's no question about that. Whether that's in the NCAA and he's coming up into the draft, or whether it's a free agent and you're able to run him against, run the data against, the entire league and be able to monitor where he is. No question. I used to say to all of our guys when we sit in and watch, all of our scouting staff, we'd be watching, and ranking all the tackles we were looking at, again, whether it was in free agency or in the college draft. And we would go on and on about, look at that. He just, he completely stonewalled that guy. I'm like, he didn't stonewall the guy. The guy was flailing, standing straight up, like the most stiff, non-athletic guy in the world, exposing his chest with no quick twitch whatsoever. Are you going to truly give him a preventing of this guy rushing the passer? Or it could be the other way around, of course, right? So I always taught and talked to our scouts about making sure they had, especially the younger ones, have a really acute awareness each play when something happens really good or really bad, and look what happened. And that could also be a trip. That could also be something that happened. So make sure that you're giving the person their due or not their due when something like that does.
Yeah. William reiterating what I just said, which is a couple of your offensive linemen that you selected have had really good years. It's interesting. You asked me this question a couple weeks ago. We said, like, what's more important, your wins or losses? For offensive line, it's very clear, right? In the running game, it's I think even, right? You do want to destroy a guy, because that's obviously going to create great holes in the run game. But as I showed with this graphic just a little bit ago, if you fuck up in the running game, it screws up the whole play in many ways, right? In the passing game, it's almost entirely about your losses, right? You want to mitigate your losses as much as possible, just the same way as if you're a defensive end, you want to get more win. You want your wins matter. Is there a mental makeup with an offense? Because this is something obviously we can't derive with analytics yet. Is there a mental makeup aspect to offensive line play? I guess we could look at, does his losses correlate, or are they independent, right? Does he tend to lose a bunch in a row and win a bunch in a row, or are his losses kind of uniformly distributed through his play set? We could obviously test that, I would imagine. For most players it's about the same, but like when you're thinking about mental makeup for a tackle, what's that for you, knowing that you want to pitch perfect games? You want the Mitchell Schwartz playoffs of 2019 where the guy went through the whole playoffs without giving up a pressure the entire time. Like, is there something you look for there?
Well, look, usually that left tackle is going to be a little bit less angst-ridden, or a little less fired up and agitated and ready to just like pull people apart. I feel like the right tackles usually has more of that, and the left tackle's got a little bit more of an easy mind about them, and thinking about mirroring and doing what they need to do, walling off. And so I've sensed that before. I will say O-line in general, and the two tackle positions, they're generally speaking, I feel like they're able to get in those rooms. They're able to share. They have usually good football brains about them, right? They understand directions. They have awareness, as I alluded to earlier, or maybe didn't allude to, just massively important. of making sure that they are smart and aware of how the game is going. That's really, really important. I'm not saying you don't have fighters. You've seen some fighters at tackles over the years, man. I mean, we want to talk about our guy. And why am I blanking right now? Tennessee Titans, Michigan. What was our guy's name?
Taylor Lewan.
Taylor Lewan. Loved him.
And actually, there's a really good question here from Taylor, who says, "Oh my God, this is an exciting." He's referring to this show. Yeah. I wondered forever about the Jake Matthews and Taylor Lewan debate. What were the deciding factors in that big decision when you're through the basic premise to dig into, please? So basically, I mean, because you had to make that choice, right?
It's a great point. Go ahead, and then I'll follow off of you if you want.
No, I mean, I think about, and again, like I'm friends with Jeff Schwartz. I've admired Mitchell Schwartz for a long time as a Chiefs fan. What I admire about him is, he was obviously very physical and very tough, and you have to be. And I played tight end in college. I wasn't that good, but and you have to be an asshole. Like, you have to be a prick, and yet it requires a great deal of you can't. The biggest difference for me in switching from wide receiver to tight end is at wide receiver, I didn't have to give a shit about what anybody else on the field was doing, except for maybe the wide out next to me. But when I was a tight end, I had to know, and I lined up right, I had to know what the left guard was supposed to do on a play. There takes a level of intelligence because these plays, and again, one of the things about this graph, and one of the reasons I created this thing was, running is less important in the NFL than passing. But the reason coaches run is because the synchrony that is required for a great run play makes everybody happy. If you execute a run play, it is the most valuable play in all of football. It's just really hard to, right? And it requires really intelligent players along the front five and tight ends and fullbacks and everything to make sure it happens. And so you look at offensive linemen and tackles specifically. Think about what you're and again, A, B, and C. You're facing the hardest athletic mismatch on the football field. You have to be tough as hell, and you have to be very intelligent. Those are the three things that are required to play offensive line. And so people are like, well, why does it take forever to, you're talking about McGarry and Lindstrom, and it's like, well, shit, imagine if you came in the league and though you're going from facing a guy from UTSA or NC State to Grady Jarrett, who's been around this thing for a lot, the old man strength and intelligence of these guys. I was watching the Ravens Bengals last night. I'm like, Calais Campbell is 6'8", 320. He's been in the league for 12 years. Of course he's going to have your lunch the first 3 years you play in the league. And so it just requires such these decisions are not easy, is basically what I'm saying.
They're not easy. I mean, look, I was texting back and forth with Caleb McGarry and Lindstrom the other day after Caleb was announced to where he was. And of course, Lindstrom got his All-Pro. And I was saying to Dan Quinn as well, in the same sort of circle of text, I said, I don't know if I've been around two guys that I really enjoyed being around as much as those two guys. They were young, of course, right, when we were there. And it was great to see them situating, just like Julio was, and Matt and Deion Jones through the different development, not to jump around here. When you come back to thinking about really honing in on those players, Taylor Lewan and Jake Matthews, right? Let's go back to that quickly for a second. Those two guys are very, very different as far as people, right? They both were really good athletes. I think they were both 7 athletes. Taylor might have been even a little bit more of a closer to an 8 athlete. Again, 8 being excellent, 7 being very good in our vernacular. The interesting thing is their personalities were very different, right? Taylor would fight you, scrap you, pull your face off. Interestingly enough about Jake is a tough ass guy. He'll fight anyone. He has, he comes from great stock with his father. So both of those guys came to the table, very different personalities. Sometimes you have to understand everyone. You pick many different elements there, not only their ability on the field, how their personalities fit in with the O-line, how our scheme was, what our system was, who our people were. You have to really dig in and say, what does our offensive line really want? How does this guy coming in, Jake or Taylor, how does he fit in with this O-line group? And people think, it should be all dictated on the best player. Sometimes it can be really, really close, but it might go towards, in this situation, it could go towards Jake Matthews because the full picture, not just the ability to move, not just the athleticism, but everything, let's go with this player. And it's, believe me, from day to day, week to week, you might even have an owner knocking on your door a day or two before saying, look, we did our run on this. And I'm not saying this about Arthur Blank, but I know this. And we have determined that because so-and-so is from the University of Georgia and he is as good, if it's this close, we would rather go to the marketing side. It's tough for a GM to hear that, right? We're going to market this guy because we think he's going to sell more tickets and jerseys. I know I've said that, but it's amazing how many things come to your table as a GM when you're making a decision between Jake and Taylor. So,
yeah, that's such good context, right? And it shows you, it also shows you the value of what, as we close here, what we're trying to do at Sumer Sports, right? I mean, ultimately, with the tools that have existed to this point, nothing is better than, like, when you look at predictive things, right? We're trying to come in and upend the league a little bit and have, an influence that no one else has ever had. But we come at it humbly, right? When you look at draft, like, and the paper by Massey and Thaler shows this, that, Thaler, the Nobel Prize winning economist, as you go, like, pick by pick, it's really hard. It's pretty noisy. But if you look at the draft curve, it slopes down. The NFL teams, they draft the better players early, they draft the weaker players late. When you look at salaries, they sign the better players to higher deals, they sign the weaker players to lower deals. What we're trying to do is make those things 2 to 10% better, but they're pretty good already, right? And so, but it's very good context where you've unveiled a little bit, Thomas, the fact that there are these ties that happen, and you look at these grading scales, and if two guys are a 7, what are you to do? Right. And you break ties. We all have always broken ties in very interesting ways in every aspect of life, whether that's selecting grad students, whether that's selecting people to work for us, all these kind of things. And what we're trying to do at Sumer is obviously make that tie-breaking process a little bit more robust over time, whether that's selecting your coach or your offensive tackle or whatever. So this has been very fun, Thomas. I've really enjoyed this. We get what's really cool for the listeners here is if you want more of this, center and guard are not the same, but they are similar, and we are going to do center and guard next Monday. So we really appreciate you coming by. We really appreciate you, whether you watch it on Twitter, whether you watch it on YouTube, or whether you listen to the podcast later on. Just remember, at Sumer Sports on YouTube, at Sumer Sports on Twitter. Please follow along. We will continue to have the best football content in the world. As I said before, when McGarry and Lindstrom got their flowers from PFF, the retweet was, these men were drafted by the co-host of the Sumer Sports Show, the best football podcast. And that's going to be the tagline relatively soon here, Thomas. So any parting words?
No, look, I want to jump back in on the O-line. Like you said, understand it is so important when you're building a team. Every GM in every world takes their heat. Sometimes they're up, sometimes they're down, right? You could be at a 4 ranked, or you could be at a 24. Most of my GM contemporaries and my buddies pull their hair out because there are just so many layers. It could be based on whether your quarterback's on, whether your receivers are running the right, whether your coordinator is calling the right play. I mean, there's so many ideas there to pull together the right team of O-linemen. And I love it. I'm passionate about it because it is not an exact science. There's so much involved, and I'd love to continue to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And with more resources going to quarterback and wide receiver and defense, we are just going to be able to, teams that can find offensive linemen for less are going to have an edge. You can't New York Yankees your way out of the offensive line, given how many degrees of freedom there are. So awesome. Well, thanks again for Thomas Dimitroff. This has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 21 of the Sumer Sports Show.